It's the week ending Friday the 26th of September, and this is the Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Donald Trump giving a remarkable hour-long speech at the UN calling climate change a con job, former French President Nicolas Sarkozy sentenced to 5 years in jail for criminal conspiracy, and the death of beloved cricket umpire Dickie Bird at the age of 92. You can read all you need to know about everything that matters in The Week magazine, but we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And in a change to our usual programming, sitting in for Harriet this week, we welcome back climate journalist Jessica Hullinger. And there is no third panellist because Jamie Timpson spontaneously and suddenly vomited everywhere just before we were about to record. So we're only going to be doing 2 stories today, and we only have 2 panellists. Luckily, it's remote recording, so it's not infectious. Welcome, Jess.
Thank you. Ladies,
this has also been the week that we've seen Jimmy Kimmel vanish from our screens, return to our screens, which has led to some conversation about the death of late-night comedy. If you could have the opportunity to go on any of the late-night shows, which one would you choose?
Oh, that's such a good question. I would go on Have I Got News for You? Does that count?
Ooh, the stress of even considering that makes me nervous.
Well, I'd like to be the presenter. Can I be the presenter?
Yeah, no, I'd like to be the presenter. That's the easy one.
And I want to go on Have I Got News for You as well, but I want to be the guest while Felicity is presenting.
Let's just imagine this is an episode of Have I Got News for You. What could possibly go wrong?
Better than my other answer, which was going to be the Rosie O'Donnell show, which was on in like the 90s in America.
Oh, I hadn't thought about the fact that we could do 90s shows. Then it's got to be Jerry Springer, surely.
Oh, yes.
Jess, yes, then we could all hit each other. Jess, you are kicking us off this week. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Bit of a gear shift here. America's rising tensions over transgenderism.
A lot of these, in recent of these trans shooters that we've seen over the last couple incidents, this flag right here is up and down 14th Street. This is what would be a trans flag. A lot of people are very threatened by this flag. It means a lot of different negative things to people, violence. Would you be opposed to taking this flag down, up and down the streets of DC?
Well, I wouldn't be. Then they'll sue and they'll get freedom of speech stuff, so that'll happen. But I would have no problem with it.
Another Donald Trump press conference. Jessica, what was this one about?
So this week, a prominent and influential conservative think tank in the U.S. published a statement urging the FBI to create a new form of domestic terrorism called transgender ideology-inspired violent extremism, which is a bit of a mouthful, but for short, it's TIVE or TIVE or TIVE. I'm not sure how they're pronouncing it, but TIVE is the acronym.
And who's the think tank and why have they done it?
Yeah, so the group that put this forward is called the Oversight Project, and they're part of the Heritage Foundation. And the Heritage Foundation is the think tank that created Project 2025, which is the rather infamous playbook that many say has been really informing the Trump administration thus far, shaping everything from like environmental policy to reproductive rights decisions. And by current tracking, about 50% of the Project 2025 agenda has now been implemented by the Trump administration.
Wow, is it
and we're
that
like
high?
8 months in.
Yeah, because I actually first heard about Project 2025 on this here show. Someone, I would credit them, but I can't remember who brought it to us as their story. And at the time, even in our discussion, we were saying, well, even if Trump wins, even if this is a covert plan to implement some right-wing policies that they're saying they won't, how many realistically are going to get through? No one would have guessed 50%, and he's not done yet.
Oh, he's nowhere near done. Given that, it's not completely outrageous that the Trump administration and the FBI would listen, would at least entertain this proposal from this group. And so, I mean, we can look at sort of what this classification would mean. It'd be a new form of domestic terrorism that's specifically focused on trans rights, groups that support trans rights. And they're sort of couching it by, like, it's a blurry definition. And in their document, they say that it would only apply to people or groups who are motivated by an ideology that encourages or condones violence and takes or incites violent acts based on that ideology. So based on this trans ideology. And this is coming from I mean, there have been some really awful and high-profile acts of violence lately. One of them in particular was a shooting in Minneapolis that was, the shooter was a trans person. And then the recent murder of Charlie Kirk, the shooter's partner was reportedly trans. And so the Republicans and the far right in America have latched onto this as being evidence that there is this movement in America of trans people who are very violent and that they want to target their opponents, and that this warrants some sort of terrorism qualification that would allow the government to really crack down on them.
Yes. I mean, there does seem to be, Felicity, albeit it is right-wing sources making us aware of this mostly, but there does seem to be some links to some trans people in some incidents of extreme violence this year. If that evidence does stack up, if it's kind of disproportionate numbers, then it is reasonable, isn't it, to inquire as to why?
Yes, to some extent, although the first thing I would say on that is that I think you need a lot of caution in trying to ascertain what the motivation or ideology behind a perpetrator of any violence is going to be. So like putting together statistics on this sort of thing, I think is going to be very problematic and very contentious. It is true that there have been some cases in recent years. So there was the case of Robin Westman, the 23-year-old former student who killed 2 children and injured 18, was transgender and reportedly wrote in their diary that they were tired of being trans, and that seems to be picked up. I mean, how much that was a factor in what they then did, like I said, is very hard to, ascertain. And there was a 2023 mass shooting at the convent school in Nashville. Again, the police said it was by a former student who was transgender. So if there is a trend, and I'm not entirely convinced there is, then yes, I guess it would be worthwhile monitoring that trend, of course. Denying that a minority group is capable of harbouring extremists just because they're from a minority group doesn't make sense. On the other side, of course, people are going to, right-wing groups are going to, grab hold of this and run with it for their own ends. What I do think is true is that violent extremists today come from across the political spectrum. It is from both the right wing and the left wing. And I read a very interesting piece in The Atlantic, actually, that said 2025 marks the first time in more than 30 years that left-wing attacks outnumber those from the far right. So 37 incidents from 2016 to 2024. And that's partly, obviously, because of Trump's election. So I guess extremists on the right feel maybe there's less need to. But you always see that swing. So when Obama was elected, that corresponded with a surge of violence from the right. So it does seem to flip around in quite a kind of obvious way. Left-wing violence used to be a lot more prominent, especially in the 60s and the 70s. You had the Symbionese Liberation Army. They were the group that kidnapped Patty Hearst and the Weather Underground. And then it sort of switched back in the 80s and 90s with the rise of more right-wing and jihadist terrorism. It's a murky picture for sure, but it's not to say that left-wing violence doesn't exist and violence by trans people doesn't exist, because it does.
Yeah, I mean, I know, Jessica, you want to talk about what it's like for trans people in America today, and we'll get there in a moment. But just on this issue of killings and violent extremism in the United States, from my perspective, it's quite interesting to see, this focus now on trans ideology-inspired violent extremism is a bit of a mask for not talking about just online radicalism in general. People who are so immersed in whatever idea it is and see nothing else because that's what they follow on social media, including Trump supporters, of course, that, isn't the bigger thing that's going on here. It just seems to me, watching this from across the pond, James Marriott wrote a great piece about this for The Times last week, a kind of narcissism, nihilism, objection to everyone, plague on all your houses type thing, which is going on, which comes from the internet. Like it's not about trans ideology per se, it's spending too much time online.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I want to talk about that. But first I want to come back and just address your question to Felicity, because there are numbers that kind of underscore how few mass shootings are carried out by trans people. Over the last few decades, it's been like less than 1%. I mean, they account for so few of the mass shootings that have been carried out in the U.S. Most of them are carried out by young, white, cis men. So I think that's really important to underscore. Not all of them, obviously, but that is a really important thing to say. And also it's important to remember that nearly 2/3 of the deadly instance of violence against trans people and gender nonconforming people involve a gun. So they are much more likely to be targeted by gun violence, and many of the acts of violence against them are perpetrated by people with a gun. So just to make that very clear. Back to your original question. So yes, so there is this growing instance of people committing violence for what seems to be sort of like no clear reason, aside from the fact that they're really sort of disillusioned with the world. And so this is why actually the FBI has created a new classification as well, another new classification for terrorism called nihilistic violent extremism.
Oh, right.
And this is exactly what you're talking about. It's NVE, and it's for groups that don't have a sort of single ideological framework that's motivating their actions. It's sort of a catch-all for people who, like you say, have spent a lot of time online, are feeling very disillusioned by the world, feel like the world is against them, everything's going badly, and it's rooted in online extremism, and they don't know what else to do, and so they act out, and it's sort of it's like attempting to like hasten the collapse of society basically through their acts of violence. And so the FBI has already created this classification that serves as a sort of catch-all. And there was a report that the FBI was considering this catch-all nihilistic violent extremism classification for trans groups. And then after that dovetailed with the Heritage Foundation actually saying, no, let's go a bit further and make it more specific. Let's make it specifically about trans people and trans groups, not just lumping them in. And so it just gives them it would give the FBI more of the capabilities to specifically look at trans groups and trans right groups.
I mean, I suppose the point is, Felicity, if there was an example of someone who believed so firmly in trans ideology and was so opposed to a particular person that they went out there and killed them as a result of their contrary views, maybe it's useful to have a term that encompasses what that means, that particular kind of violent activity. But what isn't at all clear from this new labelling of trans ideology-inspired violent extremism is that the ideology itself is violent. And the ideology could be as simple as we were just hearing from President Trump there, displaying a flag.
Yeah, definitely. There is definite overreach. And I think particularly in the wake of Charlie Kirk, I sort of feel like the levels of hysteria and that kind of witch hunt of, going after people and targeting groups unfairly is probably reaching like heightened, extreme, hysterical proportions. And it must be awful to suddenly find yourself being targeted as potentially being more likely to be violent or extremist based on, as you say, your points of view or your way of living of how things should be, which are not remotely violent at all. I think it's tricky because the TIVE, explicitly says violence and extremism. I don't think there's anything wrong with trying to go after individuals who do have nefarious aims, who are violent, who are extremist. I think there is a problem if that obviously then bleeds into very, very unfairly targeting entire groups of people who have absolutely, I think a lot of trans people actually really just want to live quietly and in dignity and in peace and don't want all this attention brought on them.
Yeah, well, one of the examples that struck me, Jess, in the tweet that this think tank put out sort of announcing this new idea, is they sort of expanded on examples where this might happen. And one example was someone who in their labelling is trans ideology inspired might say in a debate about trans people's very existence, so someone might be being told basically their identity doesn't exist or their child's identity doesn't exist. One of the arguments they might recourse to is, well, it's better to have a boy who's alive than a dead girl, or vice versa. That's a comment that comes up a lot because of the unfortunately high rate of suicides that affect people who are trans. And it's saying that is an act of violent extremism, because by saying it, you're saying to the person who thinks that trans people should be assigned only the sex they had at birth, that they are killing someone. That's not what you're saying. I find that strange.
No.
I mean, it's just clearly not what you're saying. It's a way of saying, well, better to let someone live the way they want than take their own life. I mean, that seems like a straightforward thing to say. It's not violent. And yet that is how this new idea would depict it.
Yeah, and it's all very open to interpretation. And you can see a lot of room for, like I said, basically inserting your own views and taking things out of context. I mean, the part of that document that you're referring to is a list of things that the Heritage Foundation has said that violent trans people might say in conversation, and some of the other words were really things that we all have probably said: cisgender, misgendering, right to exist, like words that are very common in modern conversation. And I think what this serves to do, I think it serves to give people a playbook by which to look for and target trans people. I think the risk here is that it generally makes people feel more unsafe around trans people, and it will make them be targeted more. Trans people will be targeted more because of this kind of declaration and categorization. It doesn't matter what the details say, really, because very few people read the details. Very few people read the fine print in this kind of classification. All they will say, and all the headlines will say, is that trans groups have been categorized as violent extremists and as terrorists, and people will take that and run with it. And I think it's really important to underscore that, like, this kind of a classification, saying something is domestic terrorism, allows the government to sidestep the First Amendment, which is why we saw the reporter and Trump talking about this idea of taking down the trans rights flags, right? Whereas in any other world, that would be a free speech issue, that you're allowed to fly those flags because it's a First Amendment right. But if you are labeled as a domestic terrorist, that trumps your ability to have free speech. That goes above and beyond. So it allows them to sort of sidestep. And I think what it would also allow them to do is ramp up surveillance and monitoring of these groups, people who already feel really unsafe in their environments. So I think it's quite... it's a really tense time.
Yes, and this isn't happening in isolation, is it, Felicity? There have been numerous changes that have come to pass, things that have changed since Trump came into power, which discriminate against trans people in a variety of different settings.
Yes, that is true. So almost immediately upon taking office, Trump moved to end DEI programs, diversity, equity and inclusion, and kind of made it quite clear that government departments would only recognise 2 genders. And that was broadly in line with Project 2025's aims, which in its kind of like manifesto of, you know, the wish list of how this government should be run, it took aim at DEI and gender terminology, and that was part of like a wider crackdown on woke ideology. So it's quite clear that is the intention that, you know, Trump has set out, that, you know, that's what he wants to bring about with this government.
And a ban on trans people serving in the military as well, Jess.
Yeah. He banned transgender people from serving in the military.
And this isn't a case just on that. It's not a case of like what bathroom they use or whatever. It's about saying people who are trans have perhaps some kind of mental disorder is the philosophy behind it. Therefore, they can't serve in the American military because they need too much medical attention. That's basically what his government edict says.
Yeah. And I mean, there are lots of other examples of so in the budget bill, the reconciliation bill, the one big beautiful bill tried to remove coverage for transgender healthcare. That was removed, but it tried. He wrote an executive order that said that passports could only list the sex that you were assigned at birth. And that has been challenged by courts, I think overturned. Another executive order banning trans women from women's sports. And then there was another just astounding report, actually, that the Department of Justice is considering banning trans people from owning guns, which, again, like, it's just kind of shocking because never has that been suggested ever after a mass shooting committed by a white male. It's kind of stunning.
And Felicity, we always, on a weekly basis, try and focus on this show on underreported stories. And the underreported element, I guess, here is the net result of what this might mean for trans people in America. But certainly, like, the trans issue, if you call it that in inverted commas, is not underreported. It's constantly there on social media. People feel like whether they are trans or know any trans people or have ever met a trans person, they can have a view on this and really define their social profile to an extent with what they say about this. So why is that? Why has this become such a lightning rod issue? Is it just being doubled down on now because Trump knows it plays well with his base?
I'm sure that is partly true, that it does definitely play well with his base. I mean, certainly stateside, again, in the wake of Charlie Kirk's assassination and this talk of like there now being a war, it definitely all seems like far more febrile and you know, it seems like the two sides of the political spectrum are even more far apart than ever. I was reading an argument that said, you know, extremists are on both sides of the political divide, but we have to find a way to disagree better. And I certainly don't think we're going in that direction at the moment. The trans issue has long been so controversial and so contested. And just to bring it back to the UK side, I was reading a review of Nicola Sturgeon's recent memoir, and obviously it was an issue that basically brought about her downfall. And I think she partly feels that she, could have done more, maybe to listen to the other side, to listen to gender critical activists a bit more. She maintains that the recent conversation in this country, we will look back on it in decades to come and be absolutely horrified how trans people were treated at this time. But obviously on the other side, you have gender critical activists who want to make their voice heard and want to kind of protect the rights of women that they see as being under threat. So I don't see the debate going away anytime soon. It is just that we have to learn to debate it better and leave violence and extremism out of it on both sides.
And Jessica, as an American, looking at Project 2025, what's left of the things that might yet be implemented that worries you?
So there's actually a website that helps to track Project 2025 and its various initiatives. And just looking at what's sort of in progress but hasn't been completed, here are a few things. So in progress, the Department of State suspend all visas to people from countries that do not accept the return of immigrants ordered deported. The White House wants to cut off government contracts to entities that enforce a woke agenda. Downsize the Office of Oceanic and Atmospheric Research because it focuses on too much climate alarmism. So these are things that are in progress. There are other things that have not yet started. So, for example, fund studies into the risks and complications of abortion, weaken regulations on baby formula.
Because when we first discussed this, Trump's answer when he was trying to get elected was, I've never heard of Project 2025, I don't know what it is. Have the White House stopped saying that now? Do they admit that this is a template?
I am fairly certain that there are people from Project 2025 that are in or closely advising the Trump administration now. So whether or not they come out and say we are implementing Project 2025, I don't know that they've actually come out and said that, but I don't know that they necessarily need to.
All right. Up next, what important appointment do most people not care about? That's after this. Felicity, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is the writing on the wall for the Church of England?
There is a hope that the new Archbishop can be something of a pastor and that can kind of go before the political aspects of the job. I think, though, the media noise around the appointment that will inevitably come and the manner of the departure of Justin Welby is only going to sort of ramp that up even further. And it means that actually, I think the new Archbishop's chances of effectively being able to be that pastor is going to depend on them first ticking off the political boxes.
Francis Martin, a writer for the Church Times, speaking on the Religion Media Centre briefing, who will be the next Archbishop of Canterbury? Felicity, is that the story? Who is going to be the next Archbishop of Canterbury, or is it something else?
We don't know, but it's expected to be announced in the next few weeks. But my story is that recent polling suggests that nobody actually cares who is elected. So 3/4 of people do not care who becomes the next Archbishop of Canterbury, and that's according to new polling.
And that includes Christians?
It does include Christians. So it wasn't a terribly big sample, I should make that clear. It was 1,100 British people. But out of the 505 who identified as Christian, not necessarily only those from a COV background, 62% also felt this way. So it sort of feels like the Church of England is gearing up to this, the biggest appointment ever. And I just thought it was very interesting that the polling suggests that, maybe people don't really care. But also the polling suggested that most people surveyed don't want the next Archbishop to be overtly political or even a little bit political. They're fine for he or she to focus on charity and homelessness, but they don't want a leader who's going to wade into the big, political debates. So we don't care who it is, firstly, but whoever it is, please don't be too political.
And is that a response then to Justin Welby, who was the previous Archbishop of Canterbury, who didn't leave for political reasons? He left for his role in not reporting a sexual abuse scandal. But, you know, if you ask the general public, what do you think of Justin Welby? A lot of them will have mentioned that we popped up on the news a lot, talking about a kind of Christian perspective on news stories. That's what people don't want.
My feeling is that Justin Welby has certainly left a very long, dark shadow that has just been a massive stain on the church that I'm not surprised if it has, you know, put people off the Church of England entirely. Just a recap on that, he announced his resignation last November over the role he played in the John Smythe abuse, which was really just appalling, sadistic treatment by John Smythe of men and young boys. And an independent review found that Justin Welby, who was at one point one of John Smythe's good friends, this report found that Welby could and should have reported the abuse much sooner, and that Smythe should have been brought to justice, and he wasn't. And then Welby followed up by initially refusing to resign over the release of the report, and 1,500 church members had to call on him to step down, and eventually he stepped down. And then in March this year, it was a very tone-deaf statement from Welby saying that he had forgiven Smythe, which only again further to kind of inflame the whole thing. So it has been a lot of soul searching and a lot of damage to the Church of England. And when you consider that it only took 17 days for the Catholic Church to get their new Pope early this year, it has also taken a long time since the end of last year to find someone.
I must say, I thought we had a new Archbishop of Canterbury because I saw someone on the news. Turns out that was the Archbishop of York filling in, doing the role whilst they're waiting. Yes. Yeah, it is taking a really long time. Jessica, are you surprised that people don't care who the Archbishop of Canterbury is going to be?
No, I'm not surprised at all. I'm not even sure what the Archbishop of Canterbury does. Like, I don't know what his official job is. I mean, I know who he is and where he sort of sits in the hierarchy of the church, but yeah, I mean, I don't know. Maybe that's partially because I'm not from here. I'm American. But I think, especially if the only reason that you're really hearing about or talking about the church these days is when you're talking about scandal, it's not at all surprising to me that people don't really have interest in knowing who the next leader is going to be. I also don't find it particularly surprising that they're struggling to get people to come to church, which is really interesting. And they seem to be torn between this decision of, like, should we try to get more young people in, you know, try to appeal to the next generation, or should we spend more time paying more close attention to the people who are already coming to church, you know, the older generations. Like, we're torn between these two sides, which is interesting. And I think there's a real opportunity because, like, I think young people in particular are looking for meaning, and some of them are turning to religion, and actually some of them are turning to the Church of England. There was a survey out in April that found that church attendance in England and Wales has actually increased 50% over the past 6 years, which goes against the current narrative that we've heard. But it was really interesting that young people were the second largest demographic in attendance. And, you know, I think these are really troubled times, and I think a lot of young people have grown up in very difficult experience a lot of really awful things in the world, and especially right now their futures look particularly bleak. You know, the climate crisis, you know, there's wars all over the world. I mean, everything feels really dark, and so I'm not surprised that young people would be looking for guidance there. So I think the church has a real opportunity to try and bring these people in. It's just a matter of how they manage to do that. And what kind of narratives they go for, whether or not they decide to make it political or not.
Yeah, that is interesting if young people means, you know, people in their late teens and early 20s rather than toddlers who are dragged along by their parents to messy play. But Felicity, can you enlighten Jessica on what the role of the Archbishop of Canterbury is? Because it is actually a formal role for everybody in this country, isn't it? Which is still on paper a Christian country. They're in the House of Lords and all the rest of it.
I mean, he sits at the top of the church, really. His most prominent role, I suppose, recently has been to appoint the king. So that's his big duty, is to appoint the next monarch.
Appoint as in by putting the crown on his head, not by doing a job interview. There's only one candidate.
No. Yes, putting the crown on top of the head. Yeah. And does wade into, Welby certainly waded into all sorts of political debates. And also there is one of Welby's legacies is that there's this historical endowment fund, which is actually quite substantial. At the moment, it stands at £11 billion. So also part of the decision-making and conversations about what happens to that money, which is a lot. And under Welby, Welby was very interested in kind of starting like new churches to attract more people in. One famous example was a Chinese takeaway turned church in Rochdale. And there's a lot of kind of infighting, I guess, in the church over that, because obviously a lot of parishes across the country are in like absolute decline. Like they are literally falling apart at the seams. And I think a lot of churchgoers feel that this money, a lot of money, should be better handed out and, you know, better spent on the churches that do exist and are crumbling rather than on finding new kinds of ministry. So actually does hold quite a lot of power and quite a lot of sway, I would say.
Yeah, and also I guess soft power too, you know, particularly in rural communities, right? You get a Church of England school, or the church is one of the things that a village has. You know, you've got a church and a pub basically, and that has a role in people's lives, whether they're Christian or not.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, some people would argue that you saw evidence of that at the recent Unite the Kingdom protests by the far right, that there actually was this Christian presence there. I think there were banners saying Christ is King. There was a rendition of Jerusalem that was sang. Obviously, Tommy Robinson claims he was led to Christ while in prison. So it did feel like I think there were some people dressed as crusaders, maybe. But there was this Christian presence. And I mean, on the one hand, you could say this, no pun intended, they were not doing this in good faith. They were doing this to try and spread hatred and fear and division. And actually, they have no intention of going back to church, and that, you know, they just want to kind of intimidate anyone with brown skin. On the other hand, could you say that some people feel that British Christian cultural traditions are under threat, whether that's your school, whether that's the baptisms, whether that's, you know, the part of fabric that, you know, makes Britain Britain, and that they were protesting that. Yeah,
and young men in particular are turning more to religion, and this is happening both in the US and in the UK. And here in the UK, 21% of men ages 18 to 24 say they attend church at least once a month now, and that's compared with just 12% of young women. And there's lots of theories for why this is, and they range from kind to not particularly kind. One idea is that men are simply less educated than women and therefore more likely to sort of believe in God and turn to religion, which is not very kind theory. And then another theory is that men feel quite emasculated by the current state of the world, and, you know, that the rise of women in the workforce, you know, that their position in the family has been demoted, and they're turning to the church for new sources of meaning. But I think it speaks to the general sort of like men in crisis narrative that we have heard a lot about. So it's interesting to ask sort of why it's specifically about men. And the other thing that I thought was really interesting, that men are turning to Catholicism a lot. Catholicism is now more popular than Anglicanism with young people here in the UK, which is fascinating. And you have to kind of ask, like, what are the Catholics doing that these young men like so much? And especially if the argument is that, like, people don't want their churches to be political or to wade into politics or to have any opinion on politics. I think that has not been at all the case for Catholics lately. You know, especially with the most recent two popes. Those two popes have been very outspoken about their views on immigration and about climate change and about various wars. You know, those are moral issues, but like political decisions are based in moral decisions, right? And so, you know, it's a really interesting trend to see sort of Catholicism try and like sort of bounce back from its years and years and years of crisis and of controversy and scandal, and actually seeing some success there. You wonder what the Catholic Church is really getting right with young people, and particularly with young men.
The other thing they can do, Felicity, to clearly send a signal that this isn't just in Welby, is to appoint a woman. We've never had a female Archbishop of Canterbury. Do you think we might get one this time?
Possibly. There are a couple of women in the running, I think. So I think the front leader is Guli Francis Dakani, who is the Bishop of Chelmsford and was a child refugee from Iran. And there's also Sarah Mullally, who is the current Bishop of London and a former NHS Chief Nursing Officer. And I think she's been quite vocal in the assisted dying debate. So actually, maybe she would be quite a political Archbishop if she was appointed. I think the CNC, the Crown Nominations Commission, who is the group of 17 who get together to vote on who it should be, and is, interestingly enough, led by the former Director General of MI5. I think they have said there's no reason why it couldn't be a woman, but it doesn't necessarily mean it will be a woman. I think Michael Beasley, the Bishop of Bath and Wells, is also in the mix. So yeah, maybe, but maybe not.
I mean, regardless of who it is, I get the sense it's a slightly impossible job, this. You know, you've got the dual responsibility of holding to account this enormous organisation that you described with its endowments and its crumbling buildings and its managerial responsibilities, and at the same time being a charismatic, open, public face who says the right thing but doesn't say the wrong thing. I mean, who embodies that? It's almost too much to do, isn't it? It's like being Prime Minister and King.
I read that in quite a few articles that I came across. You know, there was a lot of like, who on earth would take on this role? Like, honestly, who would want this role? And I was like, it doesn't really speak to like the Christian spirit, does it? I mean, a truly good Christian would probably take this impossible job just to do it for the, you know, the joy of serving and the humility and the opportunity to serve and, you know, do something good with the position. So fingers crossed someone has that mentality rather than everyone just being like, no, thank you.
Yeah. Fingers crossed doesn't seem like a very Christian perspective either. There should be another way of asking, I'm sure. My thanks to Felicity and Jessica for this week's show. You can follow us for free. You can get every episode as soon as it's released. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts, including YouTube, where you can now watch us as well. You can also get 6 free issues of The Week magazine with a trial subscription when you go to theweek.com/subscriptions. Hopefully we'll have a full panel next week. In the meantime, I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Ollie Peart at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to Unwrap next week, bye-bye.